The Magic of the Swatchways. A chilly introduction. A blustery north wind was blowing little scurries of snow around the corners of the deserted streets and moaning through the telegraph wires above the local post office with a mournful wail that rose every now and then to an unearthly shriek. The electric arc light that was suspended over the centre of the square where the main thoroughfare crossed the station road was swinging about in the wind, casting its cold rays up and down the fronts of the houses as it rocked, while the sign over the door of the Boar's Head squealed harshly as it swung to and fro. Two figures were making their way in the shadows down the narrow streets leading to the footbridge over the railway, and as they passed, a couple of locals paused before turning into the taproom of the Boar's Head and stared after them. To explain why two somewhat determined-looking young men should be leaving behind them the cheerful lights of the little country town on this wild night and resolutely making their way towards the pitchy darkness of the river, clad in old clothes and encumbered with two suitcases, a coil of rope, a hurricane lamp, some brown paper parcels that cried for tender support, and a fry-pan briefly clothed in a negligee of local news, needs but 3 words. They were yachting. It was on a Saturday night in January, some 12 years ago, and having just acquired sole ownership of a little 2-ton cabin sloop called Dabchick, which was lying at Woodbridge in Suffolk, I had enlisted the enthusiastic help of an old school friend, Derek, who I gathered had done a little sailing in and out of this river before to fetch the boat round to the moorings that awaited her at Ipswich. She was but my second venture in boats, my first having been a half-share in an obstinate and altogether disastrous old 6-ton cutter, which had taught me, during the previous summer, a respect for unhandy deep-keel yachts and their ways in crowded anchorages that took me years to get over. After a season's learning aboard this heavily sparred craft drawing 5 foot 3 inches in the Orwell River, where every mudbank had impressed itself upon my memory, I decided that the little Dabchick was large enough for my solitary requirements, and, after a cursory survey, had bought her with a pram dinghy for £36. That was just after the war, when anything that had a cabin of sorts and could float of its own free will was called a yacht, and fetched a high price. To look at Dabchick left a good deal to be desired if one's ideas ran on yachts glistening in the sun in the Solent. She was a converted ship's boat of uncertain age, with a transom stern, 17 feet overall, 6 feet beam, and drew 3 feet, with a small lead keel bolted on the bottom of the short false keel. Someone with a certain amount of optimism and an obvious contempt for post-war yachting parties had converted her for use as a small hireling on the Broads, and she had in consequence a rather neat lifting cabin top, with Willesden canvas flaps at the sides, a mast in a tabernacle, a large mainsail that was only intended for broad sailing, plenty of lockers around the well, and a minute cabin, which was my chief pride because it had 2 plush-cushioned berths and was fitted almost entirely in well-chosen varnished pitch pine, while the floor was covered with real blue lino. That the little wretch was hard-headed, slow in stays, almost dangerously tender, narrow-bowed, and being ballasted too much by the head, was very wet and suicidal in a seaway, that her big rig, standing lug mainsail and large jib was about as mad a combination for sea-sailing as could be devised, only occurred to me by degrees later. So also did the fact that her hull had seen better days, and at least 2 of the planks were pulling away from their fastenings. The man who'd sold me the boat had told me he would have her ready to sail away and lying at anchor at a spot called Kyson, about a mile below the town, where we would also find the dinghy on the beach. Here she would be able to lie afloat at low water, and we could go aboard her as soon as we arrived by the evening train. As we picked our way cautiously along the slippery sea wall that the local people of Edward Fitzgerald's native town refer to as the Promenade, stopping occasionally to retrieve 1 or 2 of our packages as they fell in rotation, we began to anticipate all the excitement of a sea passage, as we called it, on the morrow. It was still snowing in drifts as we stopped for a short rest under the lee of Everson's boat-building shed. The wind roared savagely through the poplars overhead, their tall heads waving violently against the gloom in the sky, while the fury of the gusts made us stagger like drunken figures. Somehow, as the lights of the little country town were left behind and we trudged on into the nothingness that was the river, the humour of the situation, which had been buoying up my spirits since we'd begun our shopping, left me, and I began to wish I hadn't been so enthusiastic about getting the boat around this weekend. That's the trouble with Derek, I was thinking. You mention a possible trip in a rash moment and he overwhelms you with his enthusiasm. The idea of going aboard a cold, cramped and obviously damp little boat on a night like this with the intention of rising early and sailing round to the Orwell became more and more repugnant as we stumbled along. By Jove, if we've got a breeze like this tomorrow, Derek called boisterously over his shoulder, we ought to make a quick passage of it, oughtn't we? Yes, rather, just the breeze we want, I shouted back in the kind of voice Captain Kidd might have used to encourage his crews, hoping my friend hadn't heard my teeth chatter. At last we reached the strip of shore at Kingston Quay and began to search for my dinghy. My heart gave a leap as I caught sight of a dim white shape a few yards offshore and could actually hear the water washing against the bows of my new boat. Excitement and the thrill of ownership banished all misgivings I'd entertained on the sea wall. I say it's a bit thick, Derek's voice sounded plaintive in the darkness. That old fool's left the dinghy too far down and the water's covered her anchor. Someone had to retrieve the thing and we tossed for it, with my usual luck. I should like to draw a veil over the next few minutes of cold misery when I slipped off my nether garments and waded in the icy water over my knees, found the dinghy's anchor by treading on one of its flukes, and then spent 5 minutes in the biting wind, blessing the merciful darkness all the same, running up and down the beach to dry myself before dressing again. And when we eventually got aboard the little Dabchick and found the damp-smelling cabin filled with berth cushions, blankets, a sail and a heap of gear, which had all been bundled onto the floor by the late owner, I would have given anything for a hot bath and a warm bed in a good hotel. Yet an hour later we were reclining on the 2 berths facing one another, through an atmosphere you could have cut with a knife, while the remains of a hot meal lay huddled on the locker lid which did duty as a table between us. The cabin lamp was putting up a brave fight and casting a soft warm glow over the interior of the kennel-like cabin, while a Primus was roaring cheerfully on the floor, heating up a saucepanful of good coffee. As I lay back on my berth and gazed with glassy eyes through rings of tobacco smoke at the cabin top beams, I would not have changed places with any other mortal in the world. It would have called for far too much effort for one thing. The little boat, sheering about in the squalls and snubbing occasionally on her anchor chain, was quivering with life and warmth and companionship. The wind was moaning through her rigging, and the little waves were breaking along the clinker-built sides with sudden rushes of sound. The possession of one's first boat and all its attendant interests and novelties is an experience which is to be remembered for the rest of one's life. And later that night, as we lay in our berths under warm blankets, sleep withheld her spell for a time while we listened to all the unaccustomed noises trying to diagnose each one. The sudden rasp of the anchor chain on the bobstay, the tap-tap of a halyard on the mast, the occasional squeak of a block in its eye-bolt, the scrunch of the water against the lands of the planks, and all over the continuous roar of the wind in the trees that sheltered this snug anchorage. Once, as we dozed off, the cry of a curlew, faint and shrill, came from far down the river. It sounded plaintive out there in the cold, windy night, while in here it was so warm. I awoke with that peculiar, stiff and uncomfortable feeling that one gets from sleeping in an unheated boat in winter. The temperature of the cabin had undergone a change during the night. In fact, it was now so nearly Arctic that staying in one's bunk with the hope of getting warm again was out of the question. We'd left the cabin top raised to give us air, and the draught that was pouring in through the gap above the door penetrated the blankets like a knife. I shut up the air inlet and lit the Primus, but it was not until the coffee was put by to keep warm and the bacon was sizzling in the pan that my companion fully opened the eye that had been fluttering for some time, and made a poor pretence at waking up with a start of surprise. "Good heavens, I haven't overslept, have I?" I said, "Oh no, he surely knew that I was by nature an early riser." Apparently he did not. "But it's hardly light yet." I glanced out at the grey sky that was only just beginning to pale in the east. "No, it's only 7 o'clock. You needn't get up yet. I thought you'd like breakfast in bed." He sank back with a sigh of relief. "By Jove, Maurice," he said magnanimously, "your brain must be as good as new." If we'd hoped for considerably less wind, although neither of us had dared express the wish, we were disappointed, for it was blowing as hard as ever when we started to get under way about 9 o'clock, and the squalls were coming out of the grey, snow-laden sky. The wind had backed more to the west, but it was every bit as piercing. "Now for a fine sail," Derek cried as he started to tie in reef points, but the remark began well, ended on a slightly tremolo note that rather spoilt the effect. I dared not risk my voice and remained silent. We tied in the second reef, for we found that the big lug sail, intended for the Broads, had only 2 reefs. There still seemed a great deal of it when it was set, slamming about in the gusts. There was, we found, only 1 jib, and that was big enough to fill the whole fore triangle when set on a 5-foot bowsprit. "Never mind, she'll carry it." Derek's enthusiasm was infectious, and when he broke out the anchor, Dabchick started off down the narrow channel like a rocket. The little boat almost took charge, and it was all I could do with both hands, wrenching at the short tiller to keep off the bank. At the first bend we had to jibe. Derek began to haul in the main sheet. "Keep her going until I get this swigged right in," he said breathlessly, and as he did so the boom flew over with a crash and laid Dabchick on her side until the water poured over the well coamings. Then she righted herself. We were so surprised to find the boat upright and the mast still standing that we shook hands over our good fortune, and while my attention was thus taken up, Dabchick took a wild sheer and nearly mounted the bank. However, the interval gave us time to breathe, and the flood tide, aided with the boat hook, floated us off in a quarter of an hour, and we continued our somewhat erratic progress down the river. Off Waldringfield the channel widened, and even on this cold blustery day the Deben looked pretty in the pale light of an obscured sun. The bare trees were waving their branches at us as the squalls tore through them, stripping them of twigs, while their nakedness was enhanced by the white patches of snow that lay here and there in the fields. As we rounded into Ramsholt Reach, we brought the wind forward of our starboard beam, and with her sails sheeted in, Dabchick lay over in the squalls until the water lapped into the well. At times she was overpowered, and we had to ease the jib sheet to let her luff up a little into the wind. This jib of hers was too big for the reefed mainsail and was holding her head down, causing her to carry lee helm. It had no reef points, and neither of us knew enough then to take in a temporary reef with a stopping at the head. It was about high water now, and by the time we were passing the collection of forlorn-looking motorboats and fishing craft moored above Felixstowe Ferry, the ebb had begun to race out through the narrows between the shingle banks. The sight that met our inexperienced eyes as we turned the last corner and opened up the bar made our hearts miss a beat. The entrance appeared to be an unbroken mass of white foam with leaping crests whose tops tumbled over and were carried along like steam by the wind. For one moment it was on the tip of my tongue to suggest running back, but there was a 6-knot ebb carrying us ruthlessly towards that barrier of shoals and broken water, and sailing her hardest, Dabchick would not have been able to forge against it. There was no turning back now. As he'd professed a slight knowledge of the lie of the channel over this bar, Derek took the helm while I held on to the weather coaming and watched the banks of shingle on either side racing past. A coastguardsman came running down to the point from the Martello Tower, and as we drew abreast he asked our name and where we were bound. "Dabchick, bound for Ipswich," I yelled with pride. "You'll soon be back," was all he shouted as we swept past. A minute later we buried our bowsprit into the first of the breakers. A sea leapt up, filled our jib, and the sail burst with a noise like a gunshot. At the same instant our keel hit the shingle with a jarring crash that pitched us both to the lee side of the well. Dabchick lifted her foredeck clear of the welter of water, rose on a comber, staggered on and crashed once more on the hard shingle. A third time she lifted and fell, while a sea broke onto her weathered deck and poured into the well, and then she lay on her beam ends while the furious tide swirled around her, pressing her harder onto the dreaded bank and bringing the pram dinghy alongside to leeward. "My God," cried Derrick as he scrambled up on the windward side, "I've piled you on." The remnants of the jib were flogging away to leeward in long streamers, the violence of their antics shaking the masthead. All around us was a seething welter of foam and water, while the roaring of the seas on the bar and the continual thuds as they broke against our weather side filled our ears with a terrifying tumult of sound. My attention was arrested by my companion, who was hurriedly slipping off various garments without a thought to his innate modesty or the perishing cold. "I put you on, old man," he explained, looking rather like a ballet girl as he fluttered, so to speak, in the wind, "and I'm jolly well going to get you off. So here goes." And before I could protest, he'd slipped overboard up to his waist. The boat moved as soon as he jumped from her, and when he put his shoulder under her quarter, she gave one more scrunch and sailed off, dragging him with her. "I'm all right," he cried as I tried to haul him aboard. "Keep her going till we're over the bar." The next few minutes were a nightmare, for the little boat was quite unable to cope with the steep, curling seas and simply dived into the heart of them, burying her foredeck to the mast and wallowing under the weight of water. Every moment I expected to feel her hit the ground again, but mercifully she was swept clear into the deeper water, where the seas were more regular, and I was able to round her up into the wind and help my friend aboard. "Near thing, all my fault. I hugged the shore too close," was all that he said as he disappeared into the cabin to dry himself. My thanks seemed absurdly inadequate in the circumstances. When he came out into the well again, fully dressed, and took the helm, I clambered forward to take in what remained of our jib. It looked too much like a signal of distress to be left up. Sitting astride the mast tabernacle, I hauled in the flogging strips of canvas, while the lean-headed little boat dived into half a dozen successive seas, drenching me and sending a lot of water below, squirting through a dozen places in the forehatch and cabin top. For 4 hours we tried to beat against the strong ebb that was pouring north against us, while the squalls laid us almost flat and the salt spray and sleet blinded us. The boat, with no headsail and a mainsail that was obviously too large, reefed as it was, proved almost unmanageable, carrying prodigious weather helm, and getting into irons every time we went about. Had I known then how to counteract this, I should willingly have hove to and moved half the ballast further aft. As it was, we thrashed on, grimly fighting every inch of the way and anxiously watching our pathetically slow progress each time we stood in on the port tack towards Felixstowe. That was the coldest and most miserable passage I've ever made. We were able to stand only short spells at the helm, and well I remember the agony of aching hands as one sat in the bucking cabin trying to get back one's circulation in the brief spell below, while the increasing bilge water surged up to the lee berth. By the time we brought Landguard Point at the entrance of Harwich Harbour in sight through a break in a sleet squall, the ebb tide had eased, and another tack allowed us to fetch through the shallow swatchway that used to lie in those days between the end of the jetty and the deadly Platter Sands. Here an unexpected cross-sea suddenly rose above us to windward, tumbled over and fell with a thunderous crash on our deck, seething over the cabin top and surging into the well. For one sickening moment, as the water boiled around our feet and burst open the cabin doors, it seemed that little boat had filled and was going down under us. But she slowly shook herself free of the water, lurched on and rounded the point into the harbour, very much down by the head with the weight of water inside her. While we raced up the smooth water of the harbour, I bailed with a bucket until the bilge water was below the floorboards once more. Then I lit the primus and handed out a mug of steaming Bovril to the mate who had so unselfishly risked his life for the sake of my boat. An hour later, when we lay snugly on my moorings at Ipswich, with the gear stowed and a hot meal under way, we sat in the cramped little cabin drying ourselves and declared that, now it was over, it had been a great passage and the boat herself was a wonderful sea-boat to have stood it. And the joy of ownership that I felt then, the mounting enthusiasm that swept over me like a flood, glossed over all its trials and hardships, its dangers and miseries, and I wanted to do it again, for she was mine, my boat. The joy of that moment lingers still.